Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And thanks to you, we're closing in on 90 shows. 90 shows, that's almost 2 years worth of shows. All down to you, all down to the fact that you come and join us, tune in, listen, watch every Wednesday at 7 o'clock, and you send us your questions. And so we're truly interactive. Unlike the BBC, we are not going to charge you £300 million for the show and a smattering of others. We won't debase you with information which we might likely not be able to support at some future stage. And we're free, right? So what you see is what you get, okay? Now, I've said this before, forgive me for reiterating it, but this success of this show is entirely down to your involvement, coupled with the very hard work that goes on behind the scenes in Indy Live. Now, they do much more than the TNT show. Some fantastic shows out there, and it's all free, and it's all delivered to you. I would ask you to show some gratitude tonight for that, and perhaps make a contribution to the crowdfunder, which I'll mention again at the end. It's very important. You know what? It's been another great day for British democracy. Boris Johnson has been told today, in the name of God, go. His answer to that was to look at his watch and appear less than contrite, let's put it that way. Now, in the spirit of rope-a-dope, we also hear tonight that a Tory MP has crossed the floor to join the Labour Party. It seems to me, and many others, that he'll fit right in, because he's pro-tax avoidance, he's anti-devolution, he's a climate skeptic, a Europhobe, and he's also anti-immigration. Tonight, we're talking to Chris Hanlon. Why? Well, recently Chris had an article in the papers, national specifically, advocating a third option in any future referendum. Now, I know some of you find that perhaps disconcerting and unexpected. So we'll be talking about where that fits constitutionally. We'll be talking about Europe, and we'll probably touch upon COVID as well as we go on. Now, this is important. Chris is here for a full hour, and he's taking your questions live. So there's still time to get your question in. We've got a couple or three already. Thank you for those. Details on how to submit a question are on the What's On guide at whatson.scot. So take advantage of that, please. The Nation Talks, TNT. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free, no license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks again to Chris Hanlon. Thanks very much for joining us, Chris. How are you feeling tonight?
I am not bad. How's yourself?
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. I mean, it's a bit desperate watching Westminster, I have to say. I don't understand why they have a speaker. First of all, he doesn't speak. And secondly, he doesn't chair. Now, I've chaired a whole bunch of meetings, and never, ever would I allow some of the stuff that goes on at Westminster to pass unrecorded. And people stand up at the meetings I've chaired and start spouting lies. I immediately will say, as any chairman ought, I'm sorry, you're a nice guy. I like the cut of your jib, but we're here to learn, to move on, educate, and to make decisions. And we can't make those decisions if you stand there telling us a pack of lies. These are simple things. I mean, this is not rocket science. But there we are. People go and they lie. And I mean, tonight there's a classic example. Boris Johnson said, and I think you saw this, Boris Johnson said, the cost of living is going down. Well, you know, this is as far from reality as it's possible to get. Let me just read a few facts here. This is what he said is going down. Please listen to this, right? The cheapest supermarket, someone on Twitter has said, last year, rice was selling for 45 pence for a kilogram bag. Today, it's £1 for 500 grams. That's half as much. That's a 344% increase. Now, I'll grant you, this probably doesn't affect Boris Johnson, because I'm not sure he buys his rice at the supermarket. Booze, maybe. I don't know. Maybe he puts it in suitcases. But he doesn't put rice in suitcases, I suspect. Here's another one. Baked beans last year were 22 pence, now they're 32 pence. That's a 45% increase. So when people tell you the consumer price index has gone up by 5%, it hides a multitude of sins. Have I got that wrong, Chris? Or do you agree?
No, not at all. I agree entirely. You know, it's easy to say the cost of living is going down when you don't even buy your own wallpaper. You know, so you know, it's that the retail price index and other things like that have been designed for years to conceal the increase in the cost of living, to make it look like the economy is stronger than it actually is. So I've always taken that sort of thing with a pinch of salt.
And we've still got the full effect of Brexit.
Yet to come. Can't wait.
Right, Chris, let's get down to cases here. You wrote in the papers that you said you're someone you say is a bit of a popular sovereignty fundamentalist. And I've always felt very uncomfortable, you said, with the way the 2014 referendum was framed. You take the view that you say we all knew that, in fact, the most popular option would have been Devo Max, which is the one, ironically, that was offered after it was all through. And your view was it was an outrage that people weren't offered that option. Explain to us why you felt that.
Well, I mean, it's all about democracy. I mean, what is this whole independence movement about? It's about, well, for me, certainly, I don't know about you guys, but it's about self-determination. It's about the people of Scotland getting to make their own decisions about how they're governed. Look at the situation we find ourselves in now. We've voted repeatedly since 2016, repeatedly, to have a referendum on independence. And, the reason we haven't had one is the obstructionism that's come from Westminster. In a properly democratic society where our government in Westminster, obeyed the instructions of the people, we'd have had that referendum in 2016 or 2017. We wouldn't have had this now is not the time rubbish. We'd have had the referendum that the people of Scotland had already said they wanted to have. So as someone that believes in popular sovereignty, that sovereignty rests with the people and it is devolved from them to whoever governs in their name, I kind of feel like, if you are trying to govern and get your own way by either ignoring what the people have told you to do or, actively covering your ears and just going la, 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 and just not asking the questions, that's not a democracy. That's autocracy, essentially. You are a tyrant. You're not doing what you've been instructed by the sovereign people of the nation. So, back in 2014, well, maybe not in 2014, I think back then I was maybe a bit less well informed about politics, as I think many of us were. But, in the aftermath of that and, picking through the rubble and the pieces and, rehashing what had gone on, it kind of dawned on me that, we'd had this assumption all through that campaign that Devo Max was something that was supported by something like 80% of the population. And that if that had been on the ballot paper, it would have won hands down. And it occurred to me after that, I was like, well, why wasn't it on the ballot paper? Why were we happy for it not to be on the ballot paper? Because the real answer to that is we were scared it would win. We wanted independence more than anything in the world. And we were happy to take a 50% plus one to get independence when we kind of knew that 75, 80% of the people of Scotland would have voted for Devo Max if that had been on the ballot. That, in fact, people of Scotland probably preferred Devo Max to independence. And the only way we were going to get independence was to not give them the choice, which kind of strikes me as a bit undemocratic.
It may well be undemocratic in one sense, but it was entirely democratic in another. I mean, the two leaders of the respective governments sat down together. This is representative democracy, like it or not. And they agreed on behalf of their respective peoples that there ought to be two options. One option, in fact, you could argue, do you want independence or not? So it wasn't just a question of the SNP denying people Devo Max. The UK government was perfectly happy to deny them that. And so it's not as if this was the impetus came from within Scotland. I think it was a very general view not to do that.
I think we can probably agree, watching the actions of Boris Johnson, that just because you're an elected representative of the people doesn't necessarily mean that your actions are democratic or representative of the will of the people.
Oh, that's true. But there will always be exceptions to the rule. That you'd have to accept, surely, that the basic rule that you elect parties, and the largest party then operates the executive, and that executive has to have a head, and that head makes commitments on behalf of the respective governments. I mean, that's what happened in 2014. I suspect one of the major disadvantages about Devo Max is, how do you define it?
Exactly.
Because if you put something on the ballot paper, you have to be absolutely certain that everyone knows what it means.
Well, see, this is the interesting thing that happened in 2014, is that a bunch of bad actors on the no side trumped up this idea of Devo Max that they did not define conceptually in any serious way, and crucially, didn't put on the ballot paper. So it wasn't in black and white exactly what it was. It was just this nebulous concept that they could kind of weave about in the background and kind of tease people with. And then eventually, we all saw that interview where, they nodded and smiled when they were asked, does the vow therefore mean a no vote is a vote for Devo Max? And of course, the reality of that situation was Devo Max was meaningless. And no, it bloody didn't, because it wasn't on the ballot paper, which allowed them to dangle that, tease the people of Scotland with that, and say, if you vote no, you'll get Devo Max. And then whip it away. As soon as they got their no vote, it disappeared. It wasn't on the ballot paper. There was no promises about it, so there was nothing anybody could do about it. And that's what passes for democracy in the UK.
Yeah, but this comes to the essential point. I mean, but before we come on to that, let me raise a couple of points that have been raised by people who've been kind enough to comment this evening. Alistair Bryan is asking, what stops Westminster from implementing Devo Max now?
Nothing.
Why do we need it on a referendum ballot?
Nothing. In fact, I think, was it Michael Russell that raised this in the National? And I would tend to agree with him that no, nothing would stop Westminster from doing this now. And in fact, I suspect if they want to avoid a referendum, that would be the sort, if I was in Boris's shoes, that would be the sort of thing I would do. I would pass the sort of changes, the sort of constitutional changes that were necessary to sway the Scottish public away from wanting an independence referendum. That's not going to happen because they don't want independence, and they're quite happy to ignore democracy and just continue on covering their ears.
I would hate to have you spend any time in Boris Johnson's shoes or any other part of his costume, but Alistair Bryan has a supplementary. He's saying, how does Devo Max remove Trident, allow us to control our economy, get back into Europe, or give us any control over foreign policy, protect NHS?
Well, it depends what you mean by Devo Max, doesn't it?
Okay.
I mean, the Faroe Islands have what I would call Devo Max. So the Faroe Islands, they voted yes in an independence referendum 65 years ago, something like that. And they're in a position where they are still technically part of Denmark, but they can negotiate treaties. They have negotiated not being in the EU. They have all sorts of powers that, what might be traditionally defined as Devo Max by, actors in the independence movement or independence debate even, doesn't include. So what is Devo Max? That was one of the things I was trying to highlight. What is Devo Max? It's a nebulous concept. And what I wanted to do was to say, well, do you know what? At its absolute minimum level, Devo Max has to be this. And that would be essentially what the Pharaoh says.
Okay. Let's just examine that for a second, because this is very important. You would like a triple lock, as you put it, 3 guarantees, not vows, but guarantees that would increase the power of Holyrood and put us in a place where we, the people, are firmly in charge of our own future. And the way you define those, Chris, is you say the first thing is a guarantee that the permanence of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood cannot be closed, overruled, or have its powers reduced without the consent of a supermajority of the Scottish people in a referendum. Your second point is a guarantee of supremacy of the Scottish Parliament on devolved matters. The UK Parliament may not pass laws that affect Scotland in devolved areas without a legislative consent motion, ever. And lastly, but no means least, a guarantee of the voice of the people of Scotland. Holyrood can call a referendum by a simple majority to amend the Scotland Act that is implemented based on a simple majority of the Scottish people approving it. Do you still stick by that?
Yeah. That would be what I would consider the absolute minimum level that Devo Max would have to satisfy if it were to appear on a ballot paper, because those are the powers we need. Those are the powers we may or may not have, that there's some doubt about whether we have. There's some doubt about whether they're enforceable. You know, the vow promised that Holyrood would be permanent, that Westminster would not do away with it, but it wasn't a guarantee, and nothing was done to make that so. The Sewell Convention as well, so that's Article 2 of that, that's the Sewell Convention. Again, merely a convention, not enforceable in court, blah, 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 blah. It would have to be guaranteed, and it would have to be guaranteed by rewriting the treaty that forms this nation.
Why do you think, sorry, let's deal with the permanence of the Scottish Parliament, first of all, because it's hugely important. Everything else follows from that, pretty much. Why do you think the UK government failed to meet its vow of making the Scottish Parliament permanent?
Because it was a lie. They had no intention of meeting any part of that vow. They could possibly avoid it.
How would they have done it anyway? Let's assume they were acting in good faith, and I know it's a stretch. Explain to me how a sovereign entity in London can set up a separate sovereign entity in Scotland. How does that work?
So the only way you could do that, because the issue here is the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, which is in conflict with the idea of popular sovereignty. So you have a parliament in Westminster that is parliamentary sovereign, and you have popular sovereignty in Scotland. So the only way those two things can coexist is that popular sovereignty is the case in Scotland, and parliamentary sovereignty is the case for England and the rest of the United Kingdom.
How does that work, Chris? I mean, if I'm sitting in London and I fully believe that sovereignty ought to be vested in Parliament, I fought Brexit on that basis, I've fought 2 world wars on that basis, and God knows how many other conflicts to retain parliamentary sovereignty. All of a sudden, somebody pops up and says, but in one part of your kingdom, there'll be another sovereign group.
That's always been the case. You might have been sticking your head in the sand and pretending it wasn't so, but that's always been the case. And
where's that been the case? Where is it in law? Where constitutionally does it say this?
We're very much getting into the weeds here. But, so, we'll answer this question then. How does a body that has popular sovereignty, so the people of Scotland, how do the people of Scotland surrender their sovereignty legitimately?
Well, in English/British terms, there is no such thing as...
That wasn't the question I asked you, though.
Sorry?
That wasn't the question I asked you.
But it's
so in 1320, the people of Scotland were sovereign. In 1605, the people of Scotland were sovereign. In 1705, the people of Scotland were sovereign. Yeah. Now, if you want to argue that they're not sovereign now, you have to give me a reasoned case, a logical explanation from how you can have moved from one situation to the other.
I'll give you one.
So you have to answer the question, how can a body surrender its popular sovereignty legitimately?
Okay, let me tell you how it happens. You sit down and you agree not a union. You agree in 1707 an incorporating union in which you surrender your sovereignty. Your elected officials surrendered it. They did it willingly. Many of them found it was expeditious because they got bribes, but nonetheless they did it. The elected representatives did it. So that's gone, right? What exists now is Parliament.
Well, I would contend that that's just not the case. That's
you
not.
may feel that, but the fact of the matter is, how do you?
There's no logical connection between one end of your argument and the other. The people of Scotland are sovereign. From my perspective, okay, the only way the people of Scotland can surrender their sovereignty for themselves and their heirs in perpetuity is for them to vote in a referendum, frankly, in my opinion, unanimously to do so.
But Chris,
now, that has not happened.
It's a non sequitur. You can't.
It hasn't happened. So the people of Scotland remain sovereign. The Supreme Court have confirmed that. The Parliament in Westminster have confirmed that repeatedly. The people of Scotland remain sovereign. And the fact is that there is no mechanism that has been used to surrender that sovereignty. So to say, blah, 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 reasons, and therefore the people of Scotland are no longer sovereign, that's just not true.
Reasons. No, sorry, that's not the case. The reality is, you cannot talk about...
Now you're de facto.
No. It's as simple
as... Legitimately, I said.
You cannot move from saying that the people of Scotland are sovereign. In that case, they could declare their independence like that.
They could, if they were given the opportunity to do so.
Why should they have an opportunity?
To speak with one voice.
They voted at the last election to elect by a huge majority a party that stands for independence.
That stood for holding a referendum on independence.
Nonetheless, some separatist and secessionist movements would take that as an endorsement, a mandate that the sovereign people have spoken and therefore they ought to be independent then and there. No messing around.
If it had been a plebiscite with a manifesto that said that, I 100% agree that's what would have happened.
But hold on a second. The people are sovereign. The people have spoken. Who are you to say that their views should be disregarded? On what basis? Because you didn't see something on the ballot paper that expressly said that? No.
Because you've made the case that they voted for a party of independence, but that wasn't what they voted for. They voted for a party of holding a referendum.
No,
because that's what was in the manifesto. That's what was said at every point during the election campaign.
The SNP has been standing on a platform of independence for Scotland for decades. It's never altered in that.
Absolutely. Well, it's altered the pathway that it intends to take.
Now we come to the nub of it, Chris. Because the path is only necessary if you subscribe to the view that sovereignty is vested in the Parliament in London.
No.
Otherwise, you don't need a path.
No, you need a path because you need international legitimacy. You need to be recognized by other states.
Exactly. It's got nothing to do with popular sovereignty. It's got everything to do with how the enactment of that sovereignty appears to others. That's the point. You've just made that point. I accept that point, by the way. I'm to some extent, I'm playing devil's advocate here because I want us to explore this in some detail because I think it hits upon the crucial issues of principle here, which as soon as we look away...
Can I interrupt you and bring you back to the original question, which was how do you implement the permanence and the Sewell Convention in a guaranteed manner?
Well, you can't.
Well, you can. You can recall.
You can't. Yeah, I mean, what you said at the
beginning. You can alter the treaties.
Let me give you a quick demolition, if I may, of your first point. You say a guarantee of the permanence of the Scottish Parliament. Impossible. Why? 2 counts. One, there would have to be an agreement in London that the Scottish Parliament was a sovereign entity, not the people. The Parliament is a sovereign entity.
No. There's no need for that.
Well, let me finish. And it would have to coexist with the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament, which is an impossibility. But more importantly, leave aside the matters of principle. More importantly, no Parliament in Westminster can bind its successor. So you cut a deal with government A, That government moves on. Government B says, we recognise none of this nonsense. And you're back to square one. Nothing permanent has been secured.
Here's another theoretical question then.
No, that's not theoretical. That's a fact.
Can the Parliament in Westminster either abolish the Church of Scotland, roll Scotland's education system into England's education system, or remove the independence of Scotland's legal system?
Yes.
And roll Scotland's legal system into England's?
Absolutely.
They can't.
And
it's
they can do
bound by the treaty that formed it. The treaty that formed it limits its power.
Well, of course they can do that. They are sovereign. If you're sovereign, you can do what the hell you want.
They're limited by the treaty that brought them into being.
But they don't have to honour that treaty.
They don't have to honour it, but they're legally, legitimately. Remember, I used the word legitimately very clearly at the beginning there. Legitimately, de jure, they're limited by the treaty that brought them into power. Now, they can ignore that treaty and continue running around the world doing whatever they bloody well like, de facto. But legitimately, they cannot, because they're limited by the treaty that brought them into being. And that treaty very specifically creates a Church of Scotland that is the Scottish state church and cannot be taken away by the UK. It has a separate legal system and it has a separate education system. Those are the protections built into the treaty.
If Boris Johnson wanted to abolish the Scottish Parliament tomorrow morning, he could do it.
Yeah, of course he could. That. Yes,
so of course if he can abolish the Scottish Parliament, he can abolish everything else by definition. It's not a problem. Not a problem for him. He might sometimes they go through sophistry. They use internal market bills. They use NHS, but it's all nonsense. Also, the fact of the matter is, he has the ultimate power. Boris Johnson, with the majority he has, I mean, this is the way to think of it, and it's helpful to think of it this way. I would suggest the British Constitution is whatever the government of the day, with a working majority, says it is. So they can make constitutional anything they wish. They can make the Church of Scotland illegal. They can make the Scottish legal system. They can abolish it. They can abolish the Scottish Parliament. They can do all of those things.
They can do all of those things, principally because they control the Supreme Court and the armed forces. But they cannot do so legitimately.
Yes, they can.
They lack the constitutional power to do so.
No, they don't.
The Scottish legal system is protected in the Acts of Union.
It has no protection whatsoever. It has no protection. If Boris Johnson wishes to abolish it, like the Scottish Parliament, he can do it.
He can, but he can't do so legitimately.
Define legitimate.
Legally. The jury, legally, within the constraints of the treaties that form the body that he is the Prime Minister of.
Okay, let me give you an example. Because clearly we're not moving ahead here. I want us to move ahead. The British government signed up for a treaty with the European Union. It voluntarily signed up for that treaty. At a later stage, a couple of 5 years ago, they no longer wished to do that. They wished to abrogate the commitment they made to 26 other nations in leaving. And they did it because they were sovereign. They could do what they liked. The very basis of Brexit was to return sovereignty to Westminster because they felt it was being shared. You can't share sovereignty.
To the extent that they've abrogated portions of their trade and cooperation agreement, they have done so in breach of international law, and there will eventually be consequences for that. They haven't done so legitimately. They've done so illegally.
Who sets the laws?
Well, in the case of international law, it's the international consensus. So that's maybe not the best, analogy
What is the purpose of the Westminster Parliament, do you think?
With the enrichment of the elite, the entrenchment of power.
You're even more cynical than I am. No, seriously.
That is me being serious. That's the entire purpose of the Westminster Parliament.
What's this
but certainly not democracy.
What's its legitimate function, would you say?
Its legitimate function would be the governance of the United Kingdom.
and make laws.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, it does that through laws. And that's exactly my point. Whatever they decide is legal. So to argue
within the bounds of the Constitution,
to argue that the Scottish people have some sort of protection because of legality, frankly, is nonsense, Chris. They have no protection. Right now, you and I have no protection against Boris Johnson.
No.
None. Zero. He can do what he likes.
He can do what he likes, but he cannot necessarily do what he likes legitimately.
In what way? Passing
It's a conceptual difference that you have to accept,
or
you're into a realm of madness.
If Boris Johnson passes a law tomorrow morning to say the Scottish Parliament is illegal, should be abolished, in what way is that an illegal act?
Well, it's not, because he's not constrained in that regard. But if he tries to do away with the Scottish legal system, that's illegal. It's in breach of the Constitution.
Oh, no, but they use sophistry. What they do is they say...
That doesn't matter. It doesn't make it legitimate. And this is the difference we have. You are arguing that he can do so illegitimately, and I agree with you. He absolutely can do so illegitimately. He cannot do so legitimately.
No, I'm saying...
And all you have to do is concede that, and we can move on.
No, at all. I'm saying the way he would abolish the Scottish Parliament was to pass an act bringing about its abolition. That's illegal. That's perfectly legal.
Yeah, of course it is.
And therefore he's acting...
Because that's within the bounds of his power.
He's acting completely legally and abolishing the Parliament. Not a problem. I mean, that's a fact. He can do that. All I'm saying...
But that's a straw man argument, John.
Yeah,
You've not addressed the argument I've actually made. No, so he cannot legitimately abolish Scotland's separate legal system because it's protected by the treaty that limits the power of the Parliament of the United Kingdom.
But he can abrogate the treaty. He can, for example...
But that's not legitimate. Which part of that do you not understand? It's not legitimate. Yes.
Let me explain to you. You're choosing one treaty and saying anybody who fools around with that treaty is acting illegally. But other treaties, they can change any way they like.
Well, no.
Which treaties can't they change?
Well, any treaty that the international community is prepared to...
It's not international. Scotland signed up for an incorporating union, so it's not international.
Well, that's something I would dispute. It's an international treaty between the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament.
No, it was an incorporating union. Go and look at this treaty. It's an incorporating union, which means the Scots would send so many MPs to the main Parliament in London.
It's a union that took the Parliament of Scotland and the Parliament of England, put them both into permanent recess and formed the Parliament of the United Kingdom from the proportions of MPs that were so defined in the treaty and the Acts.
And they accepted the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament in that act. Yes, they did.
No, they didn't. Again, we come back to how do the people of Scotland legitimately surrender their sovereignty? And it's not from 90-odd or 100-odd rich blokes in a room with rioters outside threatening to tear them limb from limb, saying that is so.
But
that's not a legitimate surrender of popular sovereignty. It's an illegitimate attempted surrender of popular sovereignty.
Okay. I have no problem with accepting, in my view, but it's only my view, and I suspect you share it, that the Scottish people are sovereign. I happen to believe that. But that's a belief. It's not legal.
As far as I am aware, that is the legal position. Westminster accepted that, 2 years ago now, that the claim of right, which is the claim of popular sovereignty. I am given to understand that the Supreme Court has recognised it a couple of times. And there's no legal legitimate way for it to have been removed. So it is the legal position.
It is.
De jure, it's the legal position. De facto, it could be anything you like, but de jure, it's the legal position.
The constitutional position, i.e. the legal position, is that the Parliament in Westminster is sovereign. The power is vested in the Crown and Parliament, where the Queen is the head of state, the monarch, rather, is the head of state, and then the Prime Minister reports to the monarch.
The Parliament of Westminster is sovereign because sovereignty is devolved by the Queen to it. Because the Queen is sovereign in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. But any sovereignty that Westminster has over Scotland is devolved from the Scottish people through the monarch and then to them. But it nevertheless, and I've had this phrase thrown at me a lot of times, actually, just after that article, that power devolved is power retained. Yeah, absolutely. The people of Scotland devolve their power to the monarch and then down onto the Parliament in Westminster, and that sovereignty is retained with the people of Scotland.
That is not a legal position.
It's a legal position. It's maybe not a de facto position.
Okay. There's nothing to stop. Let's assume that you're right. Okay. Let's assume you're right. There is absolutely nothing to prevent Boris Johnson, should he wish, or any other UK Prime Minister, to take what you just said and make it illegal and say that the Parliament is sovereign and there is no other sovereign entity on these islands. None. Zip. Zero. And in effect, that's...
He can declare himself to be the king of the moon. It doesn't make it true.
But it is legal, though, because he's passed a law to that effect.
No, because he's limited by the Constitution. Constitutions limit the power of legislators.
Show me the Constitution. Show me the British Constitution where it says
the Acts of Union. I'll show you the Acts of Union.
That is not the British
limit the power of the UK Parliament. Because they precede it and they create it.
But the UK Parliament is sovereign. Do you accept that?
The UK Parliament is sovereign in England and Wales.
It's also sovereign in Scotland.
And it wields the sovereignty of the Scottish people in Scotland.
The Parliament in Westminster can pass any act it wishes in Scotland.
Absolutely can. Yes, it can.
So it can.
Absolutely.
So it's the legal entity. In these islands, it's the legal entity.
It's a legislative body.
But it passes a law saying, for example, Chris Hanlon, tomorrow morning, is a persona non grata. Go. You would have no power whatsoever.
No de facto power, no.
You would have none. You would have to leave. And that's essentially what's happening right across the country right now. They've passed acts in the Westminster Parliament saying that some people are no longer welcome and they have to go. And that's because they're sovereign. They can do what they like to anybody on these islands. That's power. That's sovereignty. Scotland has no sovereignty in that sense, and therefore it is always going to be subservient to the Westminster Parliament. Now, you and I might want it to be different, but that doesn't make it different. And that's why Devo Max doesn't work. I mean, for example, you go on to say, Chris, you say, a guarantee of supremacy of the Scottish Parliament on devolved matters. But you're asking a sovereign body to deny itself sovereignty.
We're going around in circles here. And you asked me a question that you haven't allowed me to answer.
Let me ask you, you go on to say here, this is what you say. This would probably involve amending the Acts of Union.
Exactly. Right.
Then you go
there you go. There's the answer to the question you asked me 25 minutes ago.
Well, for a start, why should you agree to any such thing? Why should somebody in Surrey agree to amending the Acts of Union?
Because they want Scotland to stay in the United Kingdom.
But that's just your view. I can make Scotland stay in the United Kingdom just by passing a law.
You could make Scotland stay in the United Kingdom by rolling tanks in and dropping nukes on Edinburgh, but that wouldn't make it legitimate or appropriate.
I can do it legitimately. I can just pass a law that says the
That's not legitimate.
Kingdom. I can make it like the Spanish Constitution. I can drop a constitution tomorrow morning for the whole of the UK that makes it illegal for any part of this island to be separated from the rest of it. That's what the Spanish Constitution
be legitimate.
Of course it is, because I passed it.
Wouldn't be legitimate. You don't have the authority. You don't have the legitimate authority to do so.
Why? The way you accept that the Westminster Parliament is sovereign, right?
No, you accept that, and you keep saying it, but you don't deal with the arguments, the counter arguments I keep making.
Okay, I just asked you a couple of minutes ago. The Westminster Parliament could pass a law that says Chris Hanlon has to leave these islands tomorrow morning. No questions asked. You would have to leave.
Well, not legitimately, no, because that's a breach of my human rights.
Whose human rights? I've just passed a constitutional law saying I don't like you and you have to go.
You're a signatory to all sorts of international conventions guaranteeing my human rights. You can't make me stateless.
Why not?
Because it's a breach of my human rights and you're a signatory
so what are you going to
permanent
do?
member of the UN Security Council.
I've passed a law that says you're not welcome and you have to go. What are you going to do?
Well, I'm going to have to go, but it won't be legitimate. In the name of God, how many times do I have to say that word for you to accept it? Just because you can do something doesn't make it legitimate.
Legal, why would you leave?
Because there would be a man with a gun making me leave.
So he's legitimate. He's acting on behalf of the sovereign authority.
It's not legitimate. It's a criminal breach of my human rights. But
you'd have to leave, Chris.
Yes, but that wouldn't make it legitimate. It would make it illegitimate.
What do you mean it would make it illegitimate? I just passed a law saying you have to go. That's a law.
A law that breaches my human rights and your responsibilities in international law.
You're a citizen of this country and I've just passed a law and you're obliged to obey that law and you need to go.
Yeah.
Out. Gone. Now. No debate.
And so, de facto, I would have to leave.
Yes.
De jure, that would be illegitimate.
What jury?
De jure. De jure.
In what
way? The opposite of de facto.
Who are you going to appeal to?
Well, there's a number of places you could appeal, but the reality is that
I've just passed a law. Boris Johnson just passed a law to say Chris Hanlon has to leave tomorrow morning to the suite. Gone.
Well, the European Court of Human Rights would probably be your first protocol.
But you're
once you'd exhausted any legal.
You have to do that from somebody else. And the reason I can force you to go is because I'm sovereign. That's why.
No, because you're the one with a gun.
So much for your Scottish sovereignty that you have to leave tomorrow morning, despite the fact that you regard yourself as sovereign.
So again, I have to leave not because you are sovereign, because you ain't. I have to leave because you're the one with a gun and the willingness to use it.
But that's what sovereign means.
Wow. Right, well, we're very much on a different boat there.
If I'm in charge, if I'm sovereign, that's what it means. It means I have sovereign power.
No, you have legitimate executive authority. Not you have the power to do what you like.
Hold on a second.
Tyranny, not sovereignty.
When you argue for Devo Max, implicitly you're accepting the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament.
No.
You're asking a favour.
No.
I just don't. What is it you don't understand? Let me just put it to you.
What is it you don't understand about the word legitimate? I've said it about 90 times and you've ignored it every time I said it.
Let's say you got what you wanted. You've got Devo Max. There's Devo Max. The next government that comes into Westminster looks at this piece of paper and says, that's it. We don't obey it. We're not going to abide by it. We'll draw up a new act, whether you like it or not, and we'll pass it in Parliament. And there goes your Scottish Parliament's permanent. Like that. Gone.
In a fair world where courts enforce laws and the UK Constitution, you go to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court throws it out.
Why?
Because it's not constitutional. Because that guarantee, those guarantees have been enacted by changing the treaty that forms the United Kingdom to guarantee those things in the same way that the Church of Scotland, Scotland's education system, and the separation of Scotland's legal system are guaranteed by those treaties and acts.
No, hold on a second. You said, I hadn't torn up now. You said you wanted the Scottish Parliament to be sovereign. I'm saying...
No, I didn't say I want the Scottish Parliament to be sovereign. The Scottish people are sovereign and will remain sovereign.
You said, hold on a second. You said, this is what you said. You said, guarantee, I don't know who you're seeking this guarantee from, by the way, but a guarantee the permanence of the Scottish Parliament and Holyrood cannot be closed, overruled, or have its powers reduced without the consent of a supermajority of the Scottish people in a referendum.
Yeah.
And
they use the word sovereignty in that sense.
Hold on a second, wait a minute. They agree to that. The next Parliament in Westminster doesn't agree to it.
They agree to it. They recall the English and Scottish Parliaments. They pass the relevant changes to the Acts of Union, and that changes the underlying constitutional nature of the United Kingdom in such a way as the Supreme Court, were it acting de jure and doing its job properly, would enforce.
Why would it?
In the same way that it enforced the Parliament having to go back when he prorogued it illegally.
I'm prepared to indulge you, Chris. Let's just follow the logic of what you just said. You take your case to the Supreme Court, in which you have vested this enormous authority and responsibility. The British Prime Minister says, this is all becoming bureaucratic and nonsensical. I've decided to review the functioning of the Supreme Court, and it will start with its suspension. Gone. It never restores itself. The Supreme Court's gone. It was created by a will of the British Parliament. It's been disposed of at a whim of the British Parliament. That's it. You have no Supreme Court. Where do you go?
Court of Session.
Okay. I will pass a law saying that all Court of Session decisions are subject to a review by the British Parliament.
Well, then you've just stepped outside the rule of law.
No, you haven't.
Yes, you have.
You've passed perfectly legitimate laws.
No, you haven't. You've taken authority from the Court of Session, which is guaranteed in the Act of Union, which creates and therefore limits the powers of your own Parliament. You can do that. You have the ability to do that because you have the guns, but you don't have the legitimate authority to.
But you accept
and all you have to do is concede that, and you can ask another question. But I'm never going to concede that you're right about that.
Do you believe you can have two sovereign entities working at the same time?
Well, we do have two sovereign entities working at the same time.
Who's the other entity?
You and me are the sovereign entity in Scotland.
Who represents
We have devolved our sovereignty elsewhere, but the reality is we remain sovereign. Power devolved, power retained.
But power is devolved from the sovereign authority. It doesn't come from any other authority that used to exist. I mean, this is common sense, Chris. The Scottish Parliament is gone. It's history. If you need to restore, if you want to restore it, you have to vote for independence. What you will not restore it is to go down the Devo Max route. That will not restore the Scottish Parliament, as the people tonight are saying. What's the difference between Devo Max and Devo now?
Oh, dear.
What do you think a reserved matter is? Give me a definition of a reserved matter.
A reserved matter is a matter that the Parliament in Holyrood does not have competence to legislate upon.
How can that be if the Scottish people are sovereign?
Because the Scottish people's sovereignty is devolved by the Scottish people to the sovereign and then down to the Parliament in Westminster. So we have devolved to the Parliament in Westminster power over reserved matters.
So I decide that the Parliament in Westminster decides that the Scottish Parliament shall be a reserved matter in future. Your Parliament's just gone, disappeared.
Well, that's fair enough, because that's within the current rules.
Okay. Now, I want to make further parts of the Scottish entity reserved. I can reserve pretty much anything I wish, because I'm sovereign.
You're not sovereign.
What are you going to do?
You wield my sovereignty with my consent.
No, I do it without your consent. That's my point throughout. I do it without your consent.
Well,
I don't need your consent at Westminster. I don't need it. And you've only got to watch Westminster in action to know that they don't need your consent or anyone else's consent. They have their own consent. That's sufficient. That's what being sovereign means. You can do what you like.
Sovereignty is the legitimate source of authority.
Right, okay. In that case, how come the Scottish people cannot do what they like?
Because they're living under a dictatorship.
They're not
at the point of a gun.
They gave it up.
They didn't give it up. When did the Scottish people give up their sovereignty? When did they all troop through a ballot box or a lobby? Every single one of them go, we can't be bothered with the sovereignty thing anymore. Take it. And, our kids don't need it either. What the hell? Do without it. All of us, unanimously. When did that happen?
It happened in 1707.
No, it didn't.
Okay, if you're sovereign, why do you have to obey any laws made in Westminster?
Well,
you're sovereign.
Because that's what sovereignty is all about. You know, that's a pretty strong libertarian stance, that sovereignty means that you are the law and you can do whatever you like.
Well, isn't that how Boris Johnson operates?
We all devolve executive and legislative authority to representatives who set the laws for all of us.
Okay, but representatives are not equal. You accept that? An MP is not the same as a councillor.
This is true.
So therefore, if I have MPs, I can regard those MPs, if I'm the sovereign entity, as creatures of that state, the state that you're part of, right, for which you claim some degree of sovereignty, in fact, is controlled by an executive based in Westminster. That's a fact.
This is
they make
a fact.
Laws. These laws, because they're passed by Westminster, by Parliament, are legitimate. They're
within the bounds of the Constitution.
Where is the Constitution?
Well, as you well know,
at a whim, it doesn't exist.
Or I won't answer the question if you talk over me. Ask a question, let me answer it.
Where is it?
Well, as you well know, the Constitution of the United Kingdom is based on precedent and convention and a few bits written down here and there. And the fundamental part of the Constitution of the United Kingdom are the Acts of Union. Because the UK didn't exist before the Acts of Union. The UK was created by the Acts of Union.
No, the UK has changed throughout its history, right? The fact that Ireland left changed it again. The fact that everything changes, but it doesn't alter the sovereignty. The sovereignty is vested in the Crown and Parliament.
Everything changes, but it doesn't alter the sovereignty. And in 1320, we were sovereign individually as a people. If everything changes and doesn't alter sovereignty, you've just made my case for me.
It doesn't at all make your case for you. I mean,
God almighty. You've just said sovereignty can't be changed or taken away. But as a special case, it can be changed and taken away from the Scottish people.
Well, yeah, the Celts could have argued that they had a parliament and it was sovereign, and the Scots came in. No, I mean, it's a nonsense argument, Chris, if you think about it. I mean, I'm not for a minute, for a second, suggesting that, like you, I accept totally that I believe the Scottish people are sovereign. But that's a belief. I cannot support that in a legal sense. I cannot, because that's not the way it works. And when you talked about seeking the support of other nations in order to endorse your sovereignty, you make that very fundamental point.
In order to endorse our independence.
And on what basis can you be independent and not sovereign?
Well, no. We are sovereign. We need other nations' support to be independent.
In what way?
Because without the support of other nations, there's nothing to stop the remains of the United Kingdom behaving like Russia's behaving in the Ukraine.
Well, I would argue nothing to stop them doing that anyway.
Well, yeah. But there would be consequences for that sort of illegitimate behaviour if we were recognised by other nations.
Okay, let me ask you a different question, because this may have sounded as if we've been back and forth on the same ground, but hopefully people have found it helpful. Mark Mannott is asking a question, which is, were there a Devo Max option, would there be an order of preference on the ballot amongst the three, 1 indy, 2 Devo Max, or whatever had the most votes, in which case a plurality would win? How would it work?
The first thing I would say to Mark there is RTFA, Mark. It says so in the article, STV. Couldn't have been clearer.
So there you are, Mark. That's the answer to your question.
It's a funny thing. So Kevin's warning us that we're running out of time here. So
yeah.
I've learned a couple of things, 3 things from doing this. The first is people will hear what they want to hear. And it doesn't matter what you say or what you actually wrote, they will hear what they want to hear. I am variously a stooge for the SNP leadership or an Alba sleeper agent, neither of which are true. But it's funny that both seem to be assumed to be true by, people it's convenient to assume that for. The second thing is that, oh, actually, we're running out of time. So I think the most important thing that I've found, so what I was going to say earlier before we got into that slight tangent, is that I wrote this article because I saw people starting to talk about this on Twitter in mid-December. And there was one person in particular that accused the SNP group at Westminster of being in negotiations with Westminster to add a third option. And now, having been, on the sidelines, but nevertheless in the room for much of the 2021, I knew that to be just, pish, just made up out of whole cloth. It was just total rubbish. But, that rang alarm bells. Why is someone making this up? Why is anybody saying this sort of stuff? And it, resulted in a bit of conversation in the sort of various forums that I, hang out in and speak to people and we, knock ideas about. And, I ended up saying what was quite controversial there too, that, I believed that, the sovereign people of Scotland had the right to make their own decisions, and, taking stuff off the ballot paper because you were scared it was going to win was not democratic and it wasn't appropriate. That if there were three options, no three options should be on the ballot paper, and the people of Scotland should have the right to decide, because that's what this is all about. It's all about self-determination. And, that kind of churned away in my head for a couple of weeks, and eventually, over Christmas and New Year, I sat down in New Year's Day and just went, right, and sent that into the National as a long letter, and that kind of blew up out of all proportion. But the thing that I've learned from having done this is that I was exactly right to be concerned, because the level of interest that's generated, debate and conversation, not just within the independence movement, but from, sections of the constitutional debate, shall we say, that I didn't even know existed, I'd never had any contact with, suddenly came out of the woodwork overnight. And, that confirmed to me that something was up, something is going on here. Why is this suddenly on the debate? Why is this suddenly coming up? And it's got nothing to do with me or the independence movement. This is coming from outside the discussion of Devo Max. And so what I was trying to do there was to frame Devo Max, to really bring it out into the open and make sure we had a good, thorough, exhaustive debate on it. Because I believe, as you do, it's a bad idea. It's a really stupid idea. We are much better off with independence. And I actually think that the people of Scotland are also in that place already, having gone through Brexit. And, when it comes right down to even the ones that are still, maybe we would quite like Devo Max, when they actually examine it, which is what people are now doing, they'll realise, actually, no, this is a bad idea and it's not going to work. And I think that'll put a pin in it, good and proper.
Good. Well, I think that's been helpful. Are there any last points you would like to make, Chris, before we finish? Because we've got about 2 minutes to go.
Well, the very last thing I know this seemed a bit fractious at times.
Not at all.
But I really enjoyed it. And you know what? Spirited debate. And you know what? That's what we had in 2014. Spirited debate. We really got into the issues and we discussed things, and we just haven't been doing that. There's been a bit of kind of lifeless sort of grey sort of debate about various policy issues, and recently a lot of niggling at each other, and not really seen any of that. And actually, this has been, for all that I've been getting a good kicking on Twitter and elsewhere, this has actually been really invigorating. It's been really interesting to see people coming out and, really engaging with policy and the constitutional, debate again. And I'm hopeful that that will continue, that this will be the start of, a real, serious engagement with the constitutional debate, not just within the Yes movement, but across civil society. And I think that is going to be the case.
One of the things that I've noticed recently, just very quickly, is that the fact that the Scottish Tories are arguing now for Devo Max, not for you and I, but for themselves.
Oh, aye, yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, there's nothing like a bit of cynicism and hypocrisy
Well, again,
find
Chris,
the story.
we're just about out of time. A big thank you to you. Thank you for coming on again.
It's my
Thank
pleasure.
you for engaging in the spirited debate. And it just shows that we can have a really, I hope, meaningful discussion at the same time remain friends. And that's what we should learn from this, because after independence, that's exactly where we're going to be.
Yeah.
We're going to be having discussions with people who are on different points of view and having to get along harmoniously. So,
well, we're going to have to. We're going to have them all in the room when we're writing our constitution.
Precisely. Let's do that. Thanks again, Chris. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Look after yourself. Take care.
You too. You too.